Welcome to the War Watch podcast, a 6-episode series from the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, a joint centre of the University of Geneva and the Geneva Graduate Institute.
Hello and welcome to the second episode of the War Watch podcast. Over 6 episodes, we examine conflicts that demand our attention, bringing you expert documentation, legal analysis, and concrete actions you can take. War Watch is the Geneva Academy's new interactive online portal, which is launching next week. It's based on our IHL Focus project, where you can explore conflicts and track international humanitarian law violations in those conflicts. I'm Juliette Graf, and joining me throughout this series is Stuart Casey-Maslen, our special advisor to the IHL Focus project. Stuart will help me unpack the law and its limits in every episode, alongside guests who bring perspectives from the field. Today, for episode 2, we focus on Mozambique, where more than 700,000 people have been displaced in what the Norwegian Refugee Council calls one of the world's most neglected displacement crises. Our guest today is Joshua Niyo from the IHL Centre. He's just returned from Cabo Delgado, where he's been working on international humanitarian law capacity building with humanitarian actors on the ground. This is War Watch. Let's begin. Joshua, before we dive into the current situation, for listeners who are not familiar with the context in Mozambique, can you give us the essential history? How did we get here?
So it's a very typical way in which we got here for many conflicts on the continent. There was unrest in northern Mozambique arising out of sentiments within the community about being dispossessed from the benefits of economic stability and economic prosperity within the country. And so there was a sense in which those in the north felt marginalized from a lot of the development that was happening, particularly in the south. As the conflict escalated and as these issues became more and more prevalent, this cause was eventually, in a sense, taken on or inherited by a strong Islamist agenda, where you had recruitment by Islamists to convince young people and young persons to be involved in this conflict. And so eventually what we have is a group that emerged, now called the Islamic State in Mozambique, which had significant backing capacity as well as training and other logistical support from backers outside the context, those under the umbrella of the Islamic State. And so these began to support these young people in the north, and this then became the Islamic State in Mozambique. What is probably something to note is that within northern Mozambique, you will hear people reference Al-Shabaab, but this does not necessarily imply any connection with Al-Shabaab elsewhere. And so the conflict escalated to really the level of an armed conflict around 2017. And so probably in about a year or so, we'll be looking at 10 years of the conflict in northern Mozambique.
And you just returned from Cabo Delgado. So could you tell us what is the current situation on the ground like?
So the current situation is escalating. And so we've seen escalations in areas like Mocimboa do Praia, which is, of course, within the province of Cabo Delgado. Cabo Delgado has been the province that has bore the brunt of the conflict. All the districts within Cabo Delgado have been attacked or have had incidents of the conflict, apart from Pemba, which is the capital. But of course, a lot of the actors indicate that they are definitely armed actors within the capital as well, but not actively involved in attacks. And we've seen significant escalations also around the provinces that neighbor Cabo Delgado. So provinces of Niassa, provinces of Nampula are now beginning to also experience the violence that is, in a sense, spreading out of Cabo Delgado, where most of the violence has been. And so the recent months have seen an escalation, and this is typical with the way in which the armed conflict has taken place. It's had its, ups and downs, its ebbs and flows, with, escalations, sudden dips, especially during Ramadan periods, sometimes during national election periods, somehow the violence goes down. Sometimes the armed actors change their modus operandi. We have seen incidents where they seek to win the hearts and minds of the communities, and so they seem to dip in terms of their engagement in armed violence. But the past few months have seen an escalation, particularly in some of those areas. And so there's been a lot more displacement and a lot more impact on the civilians.
And so you just mentioned that the ISM is trying to win hearts and minds in some areas. So how does that change things or challenge things for humanitarian operations?
Yeah, it creates a difficulty because it means that you have the armed actors increasingly embedded within the communities, trying to persuade them about their mission. This persuasion about their mission is mainly rooted in a certain reading of Islam and using Islam as a way of bringing out some of the issues within the community. And so this has made it also difficult for humanitarian actors to reach the community because you have more and more armed actors present. And that has made it also difficult for them then to be able to receive the kind of assistance they need in the communities. My last engagement with humanitarian actors on the ground is that this particular engagement, winning hearts and minds, has not been effective, particularly in the communities. And so the ISM is trying to see if that could be effective in terms of winning their cause. But many say that it's not been effective in the communities, who still see these armed actors as causing a lot of violence and mayhem and instability in the context.
And we often hear the word deprioritization. So humanitarian actors saying that this conflict doesn't raise any alarm bells. What do they mean by that?
So the challenge about the Mozambique conflict, I think, is that when you look at the numbers in comparison to other contexts in Africa, the numbers are significantly higher. You see significantly higher numbers in terms of casualties and persons who are killed, and also frequency of attacks is probably a bit much higher in other areas. And so this creates a false sense that the conflict is not that serious. And I think that has had an impact in terms of how people view this conflict, also in terms of how much exposure and how much in the limelight this conflict is compared to others. That creates a misconception about the intensity of this conflict. We see significant displacement, which is a key issue, and repeated displacement because of, in a sense, the ebbs and flows of the conflict.
Thanks, Joshua, for painting such a clear picture of both the history and what's escalating now. And Stuart, we're about to launch the War Watch portal with Mozambique as one of the 5 initial conflicts. But before we get into the violations we documented, could you help listeners understand the legal framework at play here? What kind of armed conflict is this, and what international humanitarian law applies?
The conflict broke out in Cabo Delgado in 2017. When we talk about an armed conflict under international law, we're talking about where there is regular and intense violence and between a state actor and Islamic State Mozambique, obviously a non-state actor. That type of conflict is called non-international. Now, although the rules that govern non-international armed conflicts are less elaborate than those that govern conflicts between state, international armed conflicts, there are still many clear fundamental rules that need to be complied with. And that compliance is required both of the state and its military allies and of the armed group itself. Just to give you a couple of fundamental rules, anyone that is detained by one of the parties to the armed conflict must be treated humanely. That means no violence, they must be fed, they must be watered, their medical needs must be attended to. And then when attacks are launched, those attacks must be on military objective, whether that's soldiers, stroke fighters, or objects. That must be only against military objectives, not against civilians or civilian objects. And there must be no excessive civilian harm that is caused even when you target lawful military objectives.
And so, in the Mozambique entry for War Watch, you documented systematic violations, particularly by the ISM. Can you walk us through what you found? The attacks on civilians, the sexual violence, the attacks on hospitals and schools?
So, yes, I think there are two separate aspects. Firstly, Islamic State Mozambique is after resources. They are after resources to sustain themselves, to pay their fighters, and so on. And what that means is they are very often violating international humanitarian law by targeting a range of civilian objects and a range of civilians. One of those, as you rightly mentioned, is health facilities. And as of July of this year, only one medical facility in Macomia district, that's on the eastern coast of Cabo Delgado, was still operating. That's down from 7 before the conflict started. You can imagine how significant the impact is on the civilian population. They're also attacking mines. There's artisanal gold mines up in the north of Mozambique. So they attack the mines. They obviously try and steal resources, but they also extort money from the miners themselves. That's called pillage, and that is also prohibited under IHL and a war crime. And then they take hostages. They abduct civilians, they abduct tourists sometimes, and they only release them when a payment is made. So again, a serious violation of IHL, all about gathering resources. And then the other issue, as you rightly highlighted, is the appalling levels of sexual violence that are occurring. And it must be accepted that this builds on an existing problem. It's not that the conflict invented that sexual violence, but they have very significantly added to it. And I think we can say, without risk of contradiction, that some of the sexual violence involves sexual enslavement. Just to give you one example, a woman, we'll give her a name as Maria, who was 27 years old when she was taken by Islamic State Mozambique. She was forced to become a wife of one of the fighters. That's sexual violence. That's a war crime in and of itself. She was then sold on for less than $1 to another fighter. That's slavery. That's effectively the slave trade. And she was sold a second time. You can imagine, with the violence and the beatings, the impact on her life and her well-being.
And it's not just Islamic State Mozambique, right, that is committing these violations. What did you find about the Mozambican forces and Rwanda?
That's absolutely true. There is a particular problem with the Mozambican armed forces, which have been targeting fishermen off the coast of Cabo Delgado. Why are they doing it? Well, they're arguing that they are Islamic State Mozambique fighters. And in almost all cases, it seems that that is not correct. They are civilians trying to eke out a meager living, but they are being targeted, again, either targeted with violence or they're being held, and then they're only released when a payment is made. We've not seen, because the Mozambican armed forces are being supported by two states still, Rwanda and Tanzania. We're not seeing violations by either, certainly not on a widespread basis. There has, however, been concern that the Rwanda Defence Forces, which are located at a crucial area in the province of Cabo Delgado, are not doing enough to protect civilians. They're either too slow or they're not interested. And in 2024, they also used combat helicopters against a particular town. Civilians were inevitably harmed. Given the importance that Rwanda attaches to civilian protection during peacekeeping operations, peace operations, they should be showing the very highest standards of care and protection.
So, Joshua, since you were just on the ground, what is the real world impact of these violations? For example, Stuart mentioned the healthcare facilities, that there's only one center left. We hear also that MSF is suspending operations 5 times in a year. What does that mean concretely for the civilians who are trying to access care?
Yeah, it's had a huge reverberating effect. We engage with humanitarian actors that work specifically on some key health issues, ranging indeed from sexual violence to pediatrics, working with children who also bear the brunt of this conflict. We have had a lot about recruitment of children as well, is also another key area that continues to come up. But back to the impact, we have seen mortality increasing in terms of pregnant women giving birth without skilled support, malaria cases also going untreated. There's also an absence of safe access to routine vaccination. And so with all this, you still have a healthcare system that is severely depleted. And as you've mentioned, Doctors Without Borders, of course, recently suspended the activities in Mocimboa prior. And of course, this is due to a surge of violence and insecurity. And so even, MSF having to pull out is also a big dent in terms of, the kind of healthcare that people are able to access in Cabo Delgado.
So you spoke with OCHA, which is the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Mozambique while you were there. And you were explaining to me that they described hard to reach areas within hard to reach areas. What are the obstacles that are preventing aid from reaching people?
So, of course, one of the key obstacles, as I've mentioned, is the embeddedness of the armed actors within the communities, areas where, of course, armed actors have significant control. There has been a difficulty for humanitarian actors to get into those areas. Part of it has been an inertia to engage with armed actors. In comparison to the other contexts where we operate, we see that in a peculiar way, we don't see as much engagement between humanitarian actors and armed actors for the purposes of access or providing assistance to persons on the ground. And so there is a key issue there. But of course, that is also compounded by the existing legal framework within Mozambique. Is very harsh counterterrorism laws that potentially place a lot of humanitarian actors in a very difficult position, where they could be seen to be providing material support to armed actors in case they have any sort of engagement with the armed non-state actors. And so this has created a chilling effect amongst many humanitarian actors, discouraging them from any kind of dialogue with armed actors in order to provide life-saving assistance to those in need. So this, lack of engagement, also compounded by, very strong counterterrorism laws within the context, have made access to some of these areas a lot more difficult.
And very quickly, Stuart, let's revert quickly to the law. What does international humanitarian law require regarding humanitarian access?
So there are requirements to facilitate humanitarian aid. The problem, I guess, is that international humanitarian law in a situation of non-international armed conflict is nowhere near as strong as it is, for example, with respect to occupied territories. Now, one of the treaties that applies to the conflict in Mozambique is the additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions. And this does add further protection, further requirements that the state authority enable, facilitate humanitarian aid, but it is still subject to their consent in the treaty. Now, customary law and human rights law would say that you cannot arbitrarily refuse, you cannot gratuitously allow people to suffer, and certainly starvation as a method of warfare is a war crime, but the level of protection for humanitarian access is not as great as it would be in a situation of international armed conflict.
Joshua, right before you mentioned something really striking, that there was virtually no engagement with Islamic State Mozambique for humanitarian purposes. There's no dialogue. You said this is quite unusual. Can we maybe go into a bit more detail? Why does that matter, and what is preventing such a dialogue from happening?
So, the dialogue is critical, for a number of reasons. Of course, one of them is for access, especially to areas where armed actors are in control. Two, also, it's important for advocacy around, key violations or key priorities, to the community, whether it is sexual violence, whether it is, destruction of food and livelihood, so issues around food security. So for some of the protection priorities, it's important that there is an open line of communication between the armed actors and the humanitarian actors. And so, because of this, because you don't have this happening, a lot of these key issues that I'm mentioning are issues that just keep circulating within the humanitarian sector. They are grappling with this. How do we address this? How do we address that? And it's, you have this circularity of, engagement on these issues within the sector, but no real engagement, of course, with those who hopefully can bring about a change on the ground. And so this is challenging. And in other contexts, we've seen the positive impact of being able to bring some of these issues forward through a line of communication with the armed actors. But we don't see this happening in Mozambique. Of course, as I have indicated, the environment is very difficult. There's a chilling effect created by some of the counterterrorism measures put in place by the state. Also, a lot of actors, particularly local actors in Mozambique, do not have experience in engagement with armed actors. A lot of them have not, had to do this sort of engagement, whether it is for humanitarian purposes, and so there is also an issue of capacity as well.
And so, Stuart, is engagement with armed groups optional under international humanitarian law, or is it required?
So it's not required. And as Joshua rightly pointed out, in many states, the counterterrorism legislation makes it very difficult to do that. Just to give you an example, the United States Patriot Act makes material support to terrorism a domestic criminal offense. And that includes teaching of international humanitarian law, which is required of all states. That's all 197 states that are party to the Geneva Conventions. So there is a very unfortunate, one might say, illegal domestic legislation that makes it very difficult. For the reasons that Joshua has outlined, engagement is critical. It's potentially dangerous. It's potentially dangerous not just for those engaging, but also for the civilian population, but it is essential. You have to try and identify the root causes of these conflicts, as was outlined earlier, and see how they can be addressed. And it's a particularly significant time because the TotalEnergies gas plant is about to be resuscitated. There was a very serious attack by Islamic State Mozambique in 2021, and they either killed or abducted about 1,500 civilians. Some of those civilians were then taken by the forces guarding the TotalEnergies plant, and a very recent complaint has been made about complicity in war crimes because some of those individuals were tortured and executed, and others are still missing. That's at the very least an enforced disappearance, if it isn't murder. That needs to be clarified, and we need the French authorities to investigate these allegations very carefully.
Yes, very rightly so. The French prosecutors are investigating this, and so perhaps you could quickly tell us how this kind of corporate accountability fits within the international humanitarian law framework, and more broadly, what accountability looks like in a neglected conflict like we have in Mozambique.
So, as many of our listeners will know, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court does not allow for corporate responsibility. It is a purely individual criminal responsibility. But that is not the case in many states around the world. And France here is a good example. They specifically allow for corporate responsibility for international crimes. Again, many listeners will know that there's a case ongoing at the moment, or just been postponed for a couple of weeks, but is ongoing against Lafarge for the payments that it made to Islamic State in Syria all those years ago. So there is the possibility to hold companies that are complicit or that undertake or perpetrate international crimes criminally responsible. And that is what I think we want to see, a full, effective investigation, and then, if criminality is identified, a prosecution.
And Stuart, are there any new accountability initiatives that should be undertaken?
I think there's one in particular. In August of this year, local leaders from Palma and 15 surrounding villages, plus many civil society organizations from Cabo Delgado, formally called on the High Commissioner for Human Rights here in Geneva to launch a specific investigation into the events of 2021. Now, the High Commissioner's office is under incredible financial pressure, that's for certain. But surely a little bit of money can be found to give these communities, the families of those who are missing or who are dead, some sense that their concerns are taken seriously, that human rights violations that appear to have occurred are being fully investigated, and that there will be some accountability. So we hope that the High Commissioner's Office and donor states that support them will be able to support this initiative, and it will be able to take place.
So, Joshua, I like to end each episode of this podcast series with a forward-looking question to our guest. So for people listening, practitioners, policymakers, citizens, what do you want them to do with this information? What should change?
Two things that quickly come to mind. I think one is for there to be a lot more conversation about what's happening in northern Mozambique. I think it is increasingly a forgotten crisis. It is increasingly a crisis that is not in the headlines. In terms of impact on the ground, there is a growing civil society, there is a growing community of local actors, of local responders, of local humanitarian practitioners, where you call them local NGOs or local actors or national actors. And so there's a vibrance among local actors to address the questions, to address this crisis that is developing. And I think there is an opportunity there to support these local initiatives, to support the local initiatives by Mozambicans to try and address this question.
This has been episode 2 of the War Watch podcast, a 6-episode series exploring armed conflicts and the laws that seek to limit their impact. New episodes drop the first Monday of every month. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss the next one. All the reports, resources, and actions we mentioned today are in the show notes. And don't forget to check out the War Watch portal launching next week, especially if you want to learn more about Mozambique, as it's one of the 5 initial conflicts we're launching. I'm Juliette Graf. With me today was Stuart Casey-Maslen, the special advisor to the IHL Focus project, and our guest today was Joshua Niyo from the IHL Centre. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to War Watch, a podcast from the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, a joint centre of the University of Geneva and the Geneva Graduate Institute. Find us at geneva-academy.ch and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.